Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, back in our episode of Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have CNN exclusive. Colombian president says oil is at the heart of U.S. pressure campaign on Venezuela from CNN and posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, well, that's obvious. I think Trump also welcomes the distraction from his close and intimate ties to the world's most prolific sex trafficker and pedo, not to mention the disastrous impact of his policies so far and their record unpopularity. And yeah, I guess I would agree with that. If that's a tried and true U.S. tradition, start a war to distract from the other issues. And Trump definitely sounds like he might go down that path. Personally, I think it will just only be bombings and not no boots on the ground though, because as I've stated in previous episodes, I think the Iraq War was such a failure that it's going to be a few more decades where we see a boots on the ground conflict again in regards to the U.S. invading another country. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have firm tied to Kristi Noem secretly got money from $220 million DHS ad contracts from ProPublica.org, posted by CH4Lux, and I think we've talked about this exact story in another episode, but yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. It just goes to show you that, big government and big business are going to grift off of each other. It's going to be true when the Democrats are in office as well. They're going to funnel money into all their allies in the NGOs. But Reddit only cares when the out group does it and not when the in group does it. That's very much how Reddit operates. When Joe Biden was in office, if you posted a story about how the Democrats are funneling money into their friends at the NGOs, Reddit would just downvote it or censor it entirely. But this happens, and Reddit thinks this is the greatest thing ever. I see the other discussions tab here. This article was submitted to 104 other subreddits. It just goes to show you how very much Reddit is very much just a DNC circle jerk. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump says he will permanently pause migration from third world countries after National Guard shooting from TheGuardian.com, posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they added, "This is fucking pissing me off, damn." And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position in regards to immigration is if you have the resources yourself to come over here from any country in the world, I think you should be able to. But that being said, I don't think the U.S. government should be helping you come over here, and that's what a lot of times it is. The U.S. government takes in refugees on their own dollar, and I don't think that's the libertarian position. The libertarian position is if people want refugees to come over and want to fund them themselves, that's fine, but I don't think it should be, like a lot of things, I don't think the taxpayer dollars should pay for it. In my ideal system, if people want to have voluntary taxpayer dollars sent to bring refugees over, I think that's fine, but right now in a system of forced taxation where you don't determine where your taxpayer dollars are going to, I don't think that's a thing we should be spending our money on, especially when there are already tons of people here who need help. We don't need to bring in more house to feed, I would say, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have 2 days until nationwide facial recognition surveillance with Ring and Flock from YouTube.com, posted by Hot Organization 157, and that's a YouTube video from Daniel Wachter. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for nationwide facial recognition, but it's very much the direction things are headed. I would say the government's been spying on Americans. The NSA revelations were back in 2013 that the government was spying on Americans, and I don't think they've stopped since then. So ultimately the government can justify spying on you however it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And the advances in technology will probably only make that spying more efficient, like this nationwide facial recognition here. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have WAPO. Hexif ordered everyone killed in the first alleged drug boat strike on September 2nd, prompting a second hit to finish off survivors in the water in a mission led by SEAL Team 6 from Twitter.com, posted by LegioX. And that's a tweet from Alex Horton. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. If I did that, I'd be held up as an international war criminal. But the government can do it, and since they have the legal monopoly on use of force, people will just continue off their lives. It's just going to show you that if the government was held to the same standard that everyone else was, they'd be held up as international war criminals. But since they control the legal monopoly on use of force, when they do it, it's law. When the individual does it, it's crime. And that's very much at the libertarian position of working, looking at things. I would say, pirates and emperors. I was like to say, when a pirate does something, it's illegal, but when an emperor does it, it's the law. Next, we have 11/28/25. All documents signed by Sleepy Joe's Autopen will be obliterated and no longer used. Posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's the truth from Donald Trump. Any document signed by Sleepy Joe Biden with the autopen, which was approximately 92% of them, is hereby terminated and of no further force or effect. The autopen is not allowed to be used if approval is not specifically given by the President of the United States. The radical left lunatics circling Biden around the beautiful resolute desk in the Oval Office took the presidency away from him. I am hereby canceling all executive orders and anything else that was not directly signed by crooked Joe Biden, because the people who operated the autopen did so illegally. Joe Biden was not involved in the autopen process, and if he said he was, he will be brought up on charges of perjury. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that, the governance is ultimately going to be held by whoever's currently in power. Whoever was previously in power, they can just say, oh, all their orders were actually not legal, so they're not official, and therefore they don't count. And ultimately, I don't really care for that. I think if an executive order is passed, it should be able to stay, even if the next leader doesn't like it. But, ultimately, people in positions of authority are going to just do whatever they feel like. And since Joe Biden's not in a position of authority anymore, Donald Trump can say, oh, all his executive orders were illegitimate, and there's pretty much nothing you can do about that if you're a Joe Biden supporter. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump plans to pardon former Honduran president convicted of drug trafficking from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And then they added, kill the poor unarmed fishermen, pardon the wealthy elite traffickers. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but it just goes to show you that, the elites are always going to look after themselves rather than the people. And that's very much why I think government's going to be inherently hierarchical. The elites are going to control it and pardon themselves, while the poor will be they'll go after the poor relentlessly and often. But that's very much why I think we should have voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. Hierarchies are kind of inevitable, but if they're voluntary hierarchies rather than forced hierarchies like we have currently, at the very least, you aren't forced to take part in them if you don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Native American actress Elaine Miles, detained by ICE on Thanksgiving. They called her Oregon tribal ID fake, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the 5051 subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but it just goes to show you that the government can justify doing whatever it feels like, even if you do have the necessary ID. They can just say, oh, that's a fake ID, and still detain you. And it just goes to show you that, it doesn't matter how much you comply with their orders. They can still justify doing whatever they want to you, oftentimes without recourse, since they control the court system as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Donald Trump say military soon will strike land targets in Venezuela from eu.usatoday.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but if ultimately the government has the legal use of force to justify bombing wherever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump's $2 trillion plan to cash in on Ukraine's peace leaks. A Wall Street Journal report details how profit is at the center of Trump's peace talks from thedailybeast.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but I think the libertarian position is the U.S. shouldn't be involved in Ukraine's governance at all. But the Ukraine's pretty much just the U.S. puppet state at this point. That's why they put the former vice president's son on the board of one of the previously most pro-Russian companies in Burisma. And that just goes to show you that I think the libertarian position is Russia and Ukraine should be negotiating peace among themselves. But, since the U.S. is so involved in the conflict, it has to act as an arbiter. And, of course, Reddit, Reddit is gonna never is not gonna like anything Trump does in regards to it, because it's not gonna be pro-Ukraine enough for them. Because they think he's a Russian asset, because that's what the TV's been saying for pretty much a decade at this point. And yeah, personally, I think, I don't really care for Trump, but, only on Reddit would trying to negotiate peace be a bad thing, because Orange Man is the one doing it, and the TV says so, because Russia, Russia, Russia. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have how fraud swamped Minnesota's social services system on Tim Walz's watch from NYTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, federal prosecutors say that 59 people have been convicted of these schemes so far, and that most of more than $1 billion in taxpayers' money has been stolen in free plots they are investigating. This is more than Minnesota spends annually to run its Department of Corrections. Minnesota's fraud scandal stood out even in the context of rapid theft during the pandemic, when Americans stole tens of billions through unemployment benefits, business loans, and other forms of aid, according to federal auditors. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but it just goes to show you how government's going to be inherently corrupt, and people are going to seek to game the system, and regardless of which branch of the party's in power. Normally, Reddit goes after the Republican Party, but I do think this is interesting how they're going after the Democratic Party here. Normally, this guy Ninja Lover Hero seems to be very Reddit DNC shill. I'm glad they're at least going after the Democratic Party for once here, and yeah, just goes to show you that the government's going to rob you blind regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in power. Next, we have Hexif order on the first Caribbean boat strike. Officials say kill them all. In parentheses, casual war crimes, accountability is wokeness, and that's posted by CH4Locks, and that's posted from the Moderate Politics subreddit, and that's an archive link from let's see, the Washington Post. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but as I said, the government can ultimately justify doing whatever it wants to justify in regards to the legal use of force that it wields, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have this Democrat wins in Red America. He has advice for his party as the eyes 2028 from WallStreetJournal.com, posted by Donald Key, and that looks like a Wall Street Journal article on the governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear. And yeah, personally, I think if Reddit wants to go for him, I think that's probably one of the better choices. He's very much a Bill Clinton, and he's the governor of a pretty relatively conservative state, but he still has a D next to his name, so they might go for that. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for. I don't think I'll really care for him as president, but I definitely do think he's probably one of their better choices currently. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Florida GOP trying to ban pride flags and direct attack on LGBTQ visibility. And then in parentheses, yearly attempts for 4 years so far. If passed, Confederate flag will be happily flown at schools, from LGBTQNation.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, this is Reddit, just like it always does, is misrepresenting the argument. The bill says, we're going to ban pride flags and any ideological flags from government buildings. But, of course, Reddit, they're just going to take offense that, the pride flag isn't going to be allowed to be flown from government buildings anymore. But they're going to frame it as, they're going to ban all pride flags. When in reality, pride flags aren't being banned. They're just being banned from government buildings. I think the Libertarian position is, just get rid of all government buildings in the first place, just like all the other government things. But of course, Reddit, they're only able to see things through the lens of Democrats good, LGBTQ good, Republicans bad, anti-LGBTQ bad. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have opinion. We must hand control of our healthcare over the most trustworthy entity of them all, the government. Posted from BabylonB.com, posted by Fear the Creeper. And yeah, I personally would agree with that. BabylonB is very much a satire website, but I do think that's I would agree that, the government isn't the most trustworthy entity of them all. But I think the libertarian position is, if you want the government to pay for your healthcare, you should have the government be able to pay for your healthcare. If you want the private sector to pay for your healthcare, you should be able to pay for your healthcare. It's very much, what people are willing to do with their own resources. If they want to spend voluntary taxation on healthcare, I think they should be able to. And if they want the private sector to do it instead, I think they should be able to. I personally think, there's good arguments for both sides. But, right now what we have is pretty much the worst of private healthcare and the worst of public health put together with the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. And that's something that I think, is definitely not very libertarian. and probably unconstitutional. But ultimately, the government can justify enforcing whatever it feels like, even if even if it goes right over the Constitution, because the Constitution is just words on a piece of paper. What matters is how power is, whatever the government wants to justify, and that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have some a post from Libertarian Party USA subreddit I wanted to go over that I made. And I first did Libertarian Perspectives on the Declaration of Independence. And I said, as the United States prepares to enter the 70th centennial, quite a mouthful of it, I think it's worth discussion of it. The American people have lived up to its principles. All focusing on the front, not backward. The Freemasons did the map to the national treasure. I think Libertarian Perspectives that the Declaration of Independence is arguably the most libertarian the U.S.'s founding documents from the American Constitution Bill of Rights. The U.S. government ignores all of it free when ever convenient, though. I really think that the central message of how the American people were fed up with how they were being ignored by their government is something that the American people of today would be wise to follow the example of. But I think that social media has really rendered people complacent in regards to the fight for liberty. I'm sure if social media was around back then, they would have just blocked George Free on Twitter rather than actively fight for their liberty and be done with it. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, we need to, the American people need to stand up and fight for their liberty rather than just constantly circle jerk themselves on social media. But sadly, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And also, I posted where do property rights end from a libertarian perspective. And I said, so a couple months ago, I submitted a picture of a jigsaw puzzle I did to the Jigsaw Puzzle subreddit, and the company that originally made the puzzle shared my picture on Facebook and Instagram. I just learned this a couple days ago while Googling my username. I don't think I was informed that they shared it. This gets into my point about property rights. As a company that made the puzzle, I think that they should have been able to share my picture without informing me. In general, I would say that if property is not physical, people can just by doing whatever they want with it. It's why I tend to be anti-IP laws and think that people should be free to remix any existing material that is put on the internet regardless of what its creators might think. And I have thoughts. And yeah, personally, people, I think, if your property is not something that you physically own, ultimately people can justify doing whatever they want with it. A lot of the internet, you might have paywalls, but people can find ways to get around paywalls if they want to. And ultimately, I think people should try and be as honest as possible when it comes to respecting the people on the internet. But ultimately, justify whatever you feel like. If you want to get around like a paywall or a steal or take someone else's work and market it as your own, ultimately justify whatever you feel like. I personally won't care for it, but that's very much the internet. Think things are going to happen that you don't like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts there. I'm going to wrap it there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.